We did it. She's not breathing.
Right. Everything is going according to plan. We'll get the insurance money and the inheritance too.
Despite being hit by a car by these two, they had this conversation and then left the scene. I was dazed and couldn't move, but I was conscious and filled with anger. That man's voice. It was my husband. I can't die in such a disgraceful way like this. Eventually I passed out, and when I woke up I found myself in a hospital bed. But next to me, surprisingly, was my severely injured husband. My name is Lindsay Collins. I'm a 46-year-old part-time housewife. I live with my husband Phil, who is 4 years older than me. We have a daughter and a son, both of whom are already married and have their own families. Phil is a company CEO, and though I have the honored title of a CEO's wife, I have no interest in luxuries and wanted to work, so I took up a part-time job. Our married life was smooth sailing, and I had no troubles with parenting or work. Phil was focused on his work, and we didn't have much time together, but I accepted it as inevitable given his responsible position as a CEO. On a peaceful day like any other, my father got seriously sick and was hospitalized. He lived in a town 2 stations away with my brother and his wife. My father was a public high school teacher and worked as a temporary staff member after his retirement. Since my father's hospital was close to my house and it would be a burden for my brother and his wife who has kids, I took on the responsibility of caring for him during his hospitalization. My mother had already passed away, and it was a shock to hear about my father's serious illness, especially since my kids were independent, and I had plans for my father to enjoy his retirement. My father's illness progressed rapidly, and he passed away 3 months after being hospitalized. His last words were that my mother was waiting for him, so he wasn't lonely, and he left this world with a smile. At my father's funeral, despite being modest, many of his former students and colleagues came to pay their respects. My brother did a great job handling the funeral, and my father's smiling portrait seemed to be praising us, his kids. After the funeral, I returned home in the car driven by my husband. He comforted me as I was feeling down.
Your father was a good teacher. Everyone was sad to say goodbye.
He always worked hard, both at work and in parenting. It's so sudden that he's gone.
That's true. I have a business trip for 3 days. Will you be okay alone?
Thank you for your concern. I'll be fine. I have things to do, so I'll be busy enough to distract myself.
I'll try to finish the business trip as soon as I can.
Recently, my husband's work seemed even busier, with sudden business trips increasing. Sometimes he would go directly from the office to his business trips, and his secretary would even come to our house to pick up his luggage, which was hectic. When I returned home from my part-time job, I was surprised to run into his secretary coming out of our house. She said to me,
"Since you were at work, I came back to retrieve some important documents that the CEO forgot."
"I apologize for the trouble my husband caused you."
"If you're working, you can't take care of the CEO much, can you?"
Thank you always." Although I could only thank her, I was concerned about what she said. I worried that she might not think highly of a CEO who asked her to do such errands, so I called my husband to warn him. "Hey, it's not good to use an employee for personal errands. If you let me know, I can take care of it, so please do that from now on."
You were also at work, weren't you? I'll do that next time.
Sometime after that, following my father's memorial service, the will concerning the inheritance was opened in the presence of a lawyer. My father was a teacher and had a modest amount of retirement savings, but my mother, who had passed away earlier, was the only daughter of a wealthy family and had inherited a considerable fortune. The content of my father's will stated that after my mother's death, the inheritance should be equally divided between my brother and me, and the rest of his retirement money should be donated as a scholarship fund for children without parents. It was a testament typical of my father, and both my brother and I agreed to leave everything to the lawyer. My husband, who was present at the disclosure of the will, was surprised to learn that my mother, who had passed away before we got married, was from a wealthy family. A few days later, I was spending time alone at home. There were still 3 days until my husband returned from his business trip. I had been busy nursing my father during his hospitalization, but now, having no one to take care of, the time felt meaningless, and I was completely disheartened. That day I kept reminiscing about my father, and before I knew it, it was already night, and I felt hungry. I decided to have some coffee and put the kettle on the stove. Thinking about what to eat, I didn't feel like cooking just for myself, so I thought of buying a ready-made meal. At this late hour, the only open store would be a convenience store. I went outside and started walking sluggishly. It seemed it had rained earlier, as the ground was wet. My bare feet and sandals got wet and cold each time they stepped in a puddle. I reached the nearby convenience store in a few minutes and carefully chose a ready-made meal, trying not to slip in my wet sandals. As I entered the brightly lit store with lively music and passed by a few shoppers, my thoughts, which had been vague until then, started to clear up. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a memory struck my mind. It was the scene of me putting the kettle on the stove at home. I exclaimed out loud, "Oh no!" That's right, I had left the stove on. I quickly paid for the ready meal and rushed out of the convenience store, heading back home. How many minutes had it been since I left home? The water in the kettle must have boiled over by now. Had the boiling water extinguished the flame, causing the gas to leak out? Had the evaporated and empty kettle started burning from being heated? I thought I should call the gas company to shut off the gas and continued walking while looking at my smartphone screen. That's why I didn't notice it. A car speeding towards me, its headlights off. I couldn't see anything at the moment of impact. I felt a sensation of being slammed to the ground and a severe pain that took my breath away. Lying face down with my vision blurring, I saw the tires of the stopping car and someone getting out and running towards me. I thought I might be saved, but as I started to lose consciousness, I heard a terrifying conversation.
We did it. She's not breathing.
Right. Everything is going as planned. We'll get the insurance money and the inheritance too.
Hurry back home. I'll take care of the car.
Got it. Make sure you don't leave anything in the car.
I know. Hold my bag for me.
After exchanging these words, the two left the scene. I lay there feeling my breathing becoming fainter, watching the car's sound and lights fade away. Although I couldn't move, my mind was clear with rage. That man's voice. It was my husband. I can't die in such a disgraceful way. But no one was there to find me lying in the dark street, unable to move even a finger. As I lay there frightened by the cold premonition creeping over me, I faintly heard a voice from my still-in-call smartphone. I won't die like this.
We cannot understand your request. Please provide your address. This is the gas company's customer service center. I repeat.
Hanging the smartphone around my neck, I mustered all my strength to shout into the screen.
Help! Please call an ambulance.
Please stay on the line. We are connecting you to emergency services.
After that, the voice from the fire department came through the phone. I responded with my last breath and then lost consciousness, only to wake up later in the hospital. When I woke up, I felt terrible. My vision was spinning and I was overwhelmed with severe nausea. But the vomit seemed to be flowing out through a tube in my stomach, causing me to cry from the pain in my throat and back.
Mom, are you awake? Are you okay?
Mom.
I heard my daughter and son's voices. A wave of relief washed over me, realizing I had survived. Then I remembered what happened to my husband and that woman. Since I'm alive, they must feel threatened. And what about my house, which I had left with the stove on? I strained my painful throat to ask. What about the house? Phil? My children exchanged glances in response to my question. They carefully chose their words to tell me that, as I had feared, our house had burnt down in a fire. Surprisingly, Phil, who was supposed to be on a business trip, was at home and had been rescued, but was seriously injured. And almost at the same time, they heard about my accident and emergency surgery. The children were panicked by the misfortune of both parents and had rushed over. I said, "Seriously injured? A fire?" My sudden laughter startled my children. Phil had been brought to the same hospital and, at the family's request, was placed in the bed next to mine. My in-laws were there attending to him and came over in surprise when they heard me laughing.
What's wrong? Have you lost your mind?
My father-in-law also spoke as if to blame me.
Phil is in serious condition and can't even talk. What are you laughing at?
My outraged in-laws were told by the children that I, too, was still seriously injured. The in-laws, understanding that I must have been in shock, called the doctor. I was in an excited state, so the doctor administered a sedative, and I fell asleep again. I dreamt while sleeping. It was a dream about my father. He was trying to wake me up, saying I'd be late for school. He used to take care of me like that, acting as a mother substitute. But I was so sleepy, I just wanted to be left alone. Then suddenly, my father shouted with a serious face,
Wake up, Lindsay!
Startled, I awoke to find a familiar woman standing in front of me. It was Phil's secretary. She was holding a syringe, attempting to add something to my IV. I instinctively pulled out my IV and pressed the nurse call button. Stop! At my shout, Phil's secretary turned to run away, bumped into a nurse rushing into the room and dropped the syringe on the floor. The nurse's cries for help and the arrival of a doctor turned the room into chaos. Later, I was moved to a private room in the intensive care unit and put under a no-visit order, with the police taking my statement. I testified about the accident as best as I could remember, becoming a victim in the case, and was placed under police protection during my hospital stay. Eventually, as my bruises and cuts healed, and my fractured collarbone was expected to fully recover with rest, I was moved to a general ward, and the police guard was removed. This was because Phil and his mistress, the secretary, had been arrested. I learned about the events from my brother who came to visit. First, the secretary who entered my hospital room claiming to have work-related messages for Phil attempted to harm me lying in the next bed. Then the secretary was taken into police custody following a report from hospital staff but remained silent. Phil, suffering from burns in his throat, was in a severe condition, unable to breathe or speak, but recovered before me and was arrested upon discharge from the hospital. Phil insisted that my testimony was baseless and false, but the police had surprisingly obtained evidence from an unexpected source. It was the recorded customer service call I made to a gas company just before the accident. The operator who connected me to emergency services had recorded the conversation exactly as I had described in my testimony. The car that was suspected of hitting me was identified as a stolen vehicle from a convenience store's security camera. This led to the arrest of a theft ring that provided suspicious cars for a fee, revealing Phil and his secretary's connection. Regarding the house fire, it appeared to have started in the kitchen, presumably due to my negligence with the stove. Phil, seeming to be just a victim of the fire. However, a bag containing the secretary's ID was found among the remains of our burnt home, providing evidence of Phil and the secretary's relationship. My brother was deeply saddened by the incredible misfortune that had befallen me so soon after losing our father. Later, my children also visited me in the hospital, expressing their anger and sadness at their father's misdeeds. Eventually, fully recovered, I was discharged from the hospital and moved into a rental apartment arranged by my brother. My in-laws came to apologize and offered to cover all compensation and legal expenses. According to them, Phil was having an affair with his secretary. He was trying to figure out how to divorce me without paying compensation and execute his terrible plan when his mistress started pressuring him to marry her. Also, my recent inheritance seemed to have triggered his plan. He saw it as an opportunity to get both the inheritance and marry his mistress. Ironically, my mistake of leaving the kettle on the stove, which should never have happened, inadvertently saved my life and exposed Phil's crimes. Phil's return home during his supposed business trip was to answer the house phone when news of the accident came, part of his alibi. Though his business trip was planned for 3 days, he finished his work in 1 day and spent the remaining 2 with his mistress, conceiving and executing this plan, as I learned from the lawyer. Phil had taken out a large insurance policy on me, discovered during my hospitalization, which covered all my medical expenses. Later, with a lawyer arranged by my in-laws, I filed for divorce from Phil in prison and claimed $120,000 in compensation. Under strong advice from his parents, Phil liquidated all his assets and savings to pay me in full. As for the secretary, his mistress, I had no intention of forgiving her, so I claimed $50,000 in damages and $40,000 in compensation. I was uncertain about her ability to pay, but I intended to seize her assets if necessary. I had no desire to ever interact with Phil again, but I felt sorry for our children, having a criminal for our father. Although my physical injuries have healed, my emotional wounds are still deep, so I plan to take a long vacation from work and travel. It seems like with a stroke of luck, I was saved, but I can't help feeling that I was protected by something. Perhaps by my late father. I believe his call in my dream saved me. I intend to live my life cherishing this life that was protected by my father.